Good evening. Welcome to UT Brainstorms. My name is Mike Mauk. I'm a professor in the Department of Neuroscience at UT Austin. Brainstorms is sponsored by the Department of Neuroscience, and it was born out of the belief that one attribute of a world-class neuroscience department is successful public outreach. After all, no scientific discipline is more about ourselves really than neuroscience. And it's a two-way street, Brainstorms. We want to share what we know about the brain and about neuroscience research, and we want to learn from you through your questions and what you find interesting. Now, as always, we must thank Laura Anian and Elena Silva, the two neuroscience staffers who do all of the behind-the-scenes work and make everything happen, keep us in line. So thank you again, Laura and Elena. So this is the beginning of our fourth season. This is UT Brainstorms number 28. So thank you. I know there's a handful of you that have been to all of them or almost every one of them. We appreciate your support. And if you're new to Brainstorms, welcome. Thank you for being here. Now this is our third Brainstorms with this YouTube live format. And you may have noticed if you're a regular that using this format, we have tried to emphasize topics pertinent to today's crazy event. So for example, Michael Drew spoke about stress and anxiety. Last time, Dan Leahy from the Department of Molecular Biosciences spoke about the history of vaccinations and the search for a COVID vaccine. Tonight, no exception, we have Dr. Kristin Patterson, who's going to talk to us about connecting and socializing in virtual classrooms. So quickly, our format is that Kristin will give her presentation. Then her three panelists will appear. Kristin will introduce them, and then through the YouTube comment section, you can post your questions, and Kristin and her three panelists will answer them until we run out of time at 8:30. So for me, it's a great pleasure to have Kristin Patterson as our speaker. I've gotten to know Kristin quite well the past 3 years, working with her on teaching and on revamping the curriculum for our neuroscience majors. Kristin's an associate professor of instruction in the Department of Molecular Biology. She's also associated with TIDES, the Texas Institute for Discover Education and Science. It's a valuable resource at UT that helps professors do a better job. And indeed, Kristin's valuable to UT in so many ways. She's a talented and award-winning teacher herself, and then she does so much to help the rest of us do better in the classroom. And there isn't a better person to talk to us tonight about how to learn and to teach in the virtual environment. So this is where we miss the crowd. So find your own way, please, to help me welcome tonight's speaker, Dr. Kristin Patterson.
Hi, everyone. So yes, today I'm glad that Mike introduced the concept of community, and that we hope to engage you and find out what you are interested in and answer your questions, because that's, after all, really what this entire evening is about. Let's see here. So I think you should now see my screen. So we're going to talk today about really about building community. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the context of learning online or in a virtual classroom. But many of the principles of learning apply, whether you're in a virtual classroom or in an in-person classroom. So it'll be a little bit more broad than that. I would like to start out by asking, so first of all, let me just basically, I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do that, let me just give a brief outline of what we're going to talk about today. First, we'll define what learning is. We'll talk about how people learn. We'll introduce a framework for learning where learners build knowledge. We'll talk about the relationship between socializing and learning. Think about how communities can be built so that people can socialize while they learn. Think about the challenges associated with that. And then finally have some practical methods that learners and teachers can use to build community and improve learning in their classrooms. So this is your question. Consider this statement. And when you have answered the question, when you have an answer in your mind, type a number into the chat. I thought I was. Sorry, now you should be able to see the question. All right, so I hope that you came up with an answer, and whichever answer you picked is fine. I do want to talk a little bit about the answer to that question in order to define what learning is. So the human brain has somewhere around 86 billion neurons, a huge number. And each neuron is capable of making many different connections with other neurons. And those connections between neurons make neural networks. Neural networks are unique to each person, and those networks can change over time within a single person. So the more stimuli you have, or the more experiences you have, the more complex the neural networks will be in your own body. So learning is actually a process of change. And that change is the result of you interpreting and responding to your experiences. So I want to highlight a few resources that do a great job connecting what we know about learning from research into practical suggestions of what to do as teachers and learners. On the left, the book, How Learning Works by Ambrose was published in 2010. It remains timely and accessible. And it is divided into 7 principles of learning that sort of summarizes the field. And we will go over briefly the main ideas of those 7 principles in just a few minutes. The second book, Small Teaching Online, is a more recent book, and it does a great job of focusing on what matters and suggesting small actions that can make a big difference for teaching and learning. Finally, in the spirit of today's topic, I want to highlight that the last months have been a major learning experience for me, and I have benefited in many ways from interacting with others in various communities in my sphere. So some of the people in these communities are listed here, and so I want to make sure I acknowledge that as the theme of today is to learn that learning occurs in communities, that we need to participate in communities in order to learn at the highest level. So I do want to go over briefly the 7 principles that influence whether people learn. And the first one is your prior knowledge. So this is the idea that learners have prior experiences that influence knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So learners approach learning a new topic, not as a blank slate, but with some background. And this prior experience can either help or hinder learning. Learners naturally make connections between different knowledge, and the way that someone organizes that knowledge can also either help or hinder learning. The third principle is motivation. So as learners become more independent, motivation plays a larger role in the direction and quality of learning that they engage in. If a learner values the task that they're engaged in and they feel like they can be successful at it, then they're more likely to be motivated, and being motivated will make them more likely to persist and continue on with that learning. The fourth principle is integration. And so learners must integrate new knowledge into their understanding and also learn when and how to apply that new knowledge to new situations. Oops, went too far there. The fifth principle of learning is practice. So learners must target their practice toward a particular goal. So it's not just any random practice, but if learners are working toward a goal, they can practice what they need to achieve that goal. And then it's also helpful to receive feedback that relates to their performance in order to improve. The sixth principle is social climate. So we have to keep in mind, and I'm going to mention this several times, that learners are not only intellectual. They have complex social and emotional needs. And a positive social climate can improve learning, and a negative social climate can be a detriment to learning. And we'll come back to that concept in a little bit. The seventh principle of learning is self-monitoring. And so this is basically if learners are to become self-directed, then they must learn about thinking and think about learning as they learn. Little tongue twister there. So that means learners have to assess the task that is required to meet their goal. They have to plan. They have to execute that plan. They have to reflect on how things went and adjust their actions for the next time. And as they practice that cycle of self-monitoring, then they will become better learners over time. So although these 7 principles are listed separately, they work best if used in conjunction with each other. Notice also that many of these principles are based on the idea that the learner has to do something in order to learn. So that concept that learners have to do something in order to learn is a nice segue into the concept of cognitive constructivism. So the idea that this idea was first proposed by a Swiss psychologist, Piaget. And Piaget, through his work, was trying to understand how knowledge grows. The theory that describes his ideas is called cognitive constructivism. So as we mentioned before, prior knowledge, everyone as a learner starts out with some prior knowledge. So everyone has an understanding or framework of how the world works. Sometimes that understanding might be correct, it might be incomplete, it might be completely incorrect. So when new information comes in, that new information will challenge the prior knowledge or challenge the original views. And if, after thinking about it, the individual realizes that that new knowledge is consistent, then their current worldview is validated. But if that new knowledge is inconsistent, then that creates something called dissonance. And they have this struggle then between the prior knowledge, their prior view of what the world is like, and what this new knowledge is telling them it's like. And so they have to reconcile that and explain it. In that process of reconciling new knowledge with prior knowledge that don't match each other, then the learner has to be willing to accept that their worldview may be incorrect, and they have to change their thinking, and that's where learning happens. So when we're talking about learning happens, we're talking about new neural networks forming. So this concept of constructivism matches very well with the teaching methods that are active. So active learning methods. Some examples of active learning methods are having learners explain concepts in their own words. The reading can even be made active by providing reading guides with questions where students answer questions while they're reading. And those questions may help students to organize their new knowledge that they're gaining. So this concept of active learning, there's many different specific methods that can be used to get students to do something active in order to learn. And there's been quite a lot of literature on the advantages of active learning over passive learning. So it is easy to forget that learners are people. They're not automatons. And so we have to really keep reminding ourselves that learners are real people with complex social and emotional needs. And that's where we cue another psychologist, a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky. And Vygotsky argued that language and culture are integral to being human and to learning. Having language allows humans to engage in social activity to a great extent, and that learning is enhanced through social interaction. Vygotsky coined a phrase called the zone of proximal development, and that gives a name to conditions under which learning is greatest. So the basic idea is that people can do some tasks on their own. They can do more complicated tasks than they can do on their own if they have help from others. And then some tasks are so complex for a particular person at that moment that they can't do it at all, even if they have help from others. So Vygotsky argues that the best learning happens in the zone of proximal development, which is in the place where the tasks that the learner is being asked to do are too complex for them to do by themselves, but they can do those tasks with others helping them. So we would say like sort of a sweet spot for learning is in that green ring where the task is too hard to do on your own, but can be done with help. I also just wanted to relabel those rings to say that the yellow tasks you can do on your own, we might call the comfort zone, whereas the zone of proximal development is the learning zone, and the red outside ring, that are things that are too difficult for it to even do with help are that panic zone. And I want to emphasize that if you're learning something, or if you think you're learning something and you don't have some discomfort, then you're probably in the comfort zone and you may not actually be learning much. So it's maybe an internal check that you can make for yourself when you're learning to say, okay, if I'm actually learning something, that I should probably be doing something that's like on the edge of what I'm capable of doing, but not so far out that it really makes you panic. So Vygotsky's views are called social constructivism. So it's still a constructive view where the learners have to construct their own understanding, but they do this socially with other people. And there are teaching methods that mesh very well with social constructivism. And those teaching methods are going to be collaborative. So things like having discussions, having groups that solve problems together, having some learners teach other learners. Okay, so the idea with social constructivism is that the teaching methods should be collaborative and that that's where the best learning occurs. So I want to come back to this concept that students are real people with complex and social and emotional needs. And when the social aspect of learning is neglected, students are not engaged. There's low participation, high attrition, meaning dropping out of the learning, just opting out of learning. When we're teaching and learning online, it's easy to forget that there is a real person behind each of those little pictures on the screen. And you can even see here that, very often they're just black boxes or there's nobody in the picture, okay? And so it's very difficult when you're looking at a screen like this to think of the people behind the pictures. So Darby Flower, who's the author of Small Teaching Online, describes the appearance of this neglect like this picture. Like the neglect meaning that there's no sense that the learners are people. She describes this in Small Teaching Online as like tumbleweeds blowing forlornly across the deserted, dusty road. So this is obviously something that we want to avoid. With that said, keep in mind that learning online does not have, it's not the only environment that suffers from neglect of social and emotional needs. So just because you're in person does not mean that the social and emotional needs of students are being met. So it's not really something unique to online learning. It's so the social aspect of learning can be neglected, whether you're online or whether you're in person. And being aware of the importance of that social aspect of learning can help direct the attention of students and teachers to the need to pay attention to it. Also, social and emotional aspects of learning is not unique to university education. It's also important for all ages. So this picture reminds me of Ferris Bueller. So regardless of the age of the learner, the learners will have social and emotional needs that have to be paid attention to when you're setting up, if you're a teacher, when you're setting up the classroom environment. And again, whether you're in person or whether you're online or in a virtual environment, it's possible to pay attention to those social and emotional needs and set up a community situation where the learners do feel engaged in learning. So when a robust community of learners is built in a class, the individual student learning and satisfaction is increased. Participation, motivation, and retention are better. In a robust community of learners, everyone in the community, including teachers, including students, including the students' peers and groups, are all perceived as being real people, even in an online environment. And also, everyone feels like they belong there. And again, this isn't restricted to adult learners. Classroom situations with young people can also pay attention to the social and emotional needs of their learners and create this robust community that facilitates learning. And then finally, it's not restricted, the idea of paying attention to social and emotional needs of the learners is not restricted to in-person classes. You can also pay attention to those needs if you're teaching online. And so your Zoom meetings can look a whole lot different depending on whether you have paid attention to building this community or not. So in 1999, Canadian researchers published a framework that's shown here that has stood the test of time for how to build what they call a community of inquiry. And there's 3 pillars of their framework, and those 3 pillars are shown here, and they're cognitive presence, social presence, and teaching presence. So cognitive presence is this idea that learners construct meaning, they construct their learning or their knowledge through communication. And that means that the activities that learners could participate in order to create that cognitive presence in a learning environment is that the students should be reflecting on their learning. They should be reflecting on meaning. They should be making connections between what they're learning and what they have learned before. And also, importantly, they should be open to changing their thinking. So they have to be open to new ideas. This is one aspect of learning that both learners and teachers should pay attention to: the interaction between the students, the learners, and the material that they're learning. A second pillar of the community of inquiry is social presence. And basically what this means is that learners are able to present their true selves into the community. So this is that concept of the participants in the community, or the learners, are considered to be real people. And activities that support that view that the participants in the learning community are real people are establishing open communication where everyone feels comfortable to share their selves. They can express their true selves, and they can form cohesive groups that interact well together. And then finally, the third pillar is teaching presence. And teaching presence is the idea that teachers support the development of cognitive presence and social presence. So the teaching presence supports the other two. And that has to do with, the teaching presence has to do with the design of the course, and in the sense that there's opportunity for learners to construct meaning, and there's opportunities for learners to develop community in the course. And that will happen ahead of the learning and as part of the design, and also while the learning is happening in terms of facilitation of the learning. So now I want to zoom in on that social presence pillar, because that's the most likely is the difficult one to achieve right now, that social presence. So we want to sort of focus on the more difficult thing right now. So this is a picture that might be familiar, cafeteria in a school, and that's probably not happening very much right now. Okay, so this picture is not depicting a challenge. Like, this is a good thing where learners are getting together with each other and they're communicating and talking. And these kind of events happen in elementary school, and they also happen with older learners, where people are getting together in groups and interacting with each other. And very often these kind of interactions happen spontaneously. You might just run into somebody that you know on the street, or if you're in a class, you might chat for a couple minutes before the class begins. You can see, when you're in a physical environment with someone, you can see how they're reacting. And it's much easier to think of someone as a real person if you can interact with them, physically in person. So I do want to say, though, that these challenges, the lack of social interaction, is not really, right now, this is not really a problem imposed by online learning, but is more directly imposed by our current environment undergoing a pandemic. Okay, so we are all told to be socially distancing, and I would argue that maybe we should change that word to say that we should be physically distancing. So we should stay apart from each other, but that there are still ways that we can be socially connected, even if we're physically apart. So, and that we can do that in our classes, okay? So I want to get into the last part where we talk about how to build a social community online. And there's a lot of things that the teacher can do to build this structure into the course design, and also into the facilitation of the learning process. So one thing to think about is to really build time for socializing and networking and working together into the learning process. It's very tempting to think about all of the knowledge and skills and attitudes that you want students to acquire during the learning process. And it's easy to forget that students will acquire knowledge and skills and attitudes better if you also incorporate a social aspect into the learning experience. Okay, so it's worth it to spend time not only on the content of the course, but also on the social aspect of the course. Another way that teachers can build a social presence or community is to be real themselves, share real stories about themselves. And these aren't meant to be complaining stories, but instead stories of maybe where you had a challenge and you overcame that challenge and how you did it. And share stories about yourself, like what you like to do and what your life is like. So it's important that those stories that you share are sort of positive stories about yourself, or at least they have a positive ending rather than negative stories. So another aspect that relates to community, another aspect of course design that relates to community is structure. And is in particular having the structure of the course have a routine, so that everyone gets used to what it means to be in your course or studying this particular thing. So you may have like a weekly cycle of learning that is repeated over and over and over again. Or you may have a particular thing that you do on a particular day each week. And it reminds me kind of celebrating holidays, when you have milestones or routines, that something that you do every year or every certain period of time in your family. Then you can incorporate that into your class, where you have some sort of routine that is expected on a periodic basis in the class, and that can help to build community. It makes the identity of your class. Another, again, different way to build community in your class is to give explicit instructions. And when we're learning online, you have to really, it's amazing, give way more instructions than you might have thought that you would have given if you were in person, because you're not having all of those spontaneous interactions with people where you can explain something. It all has to be presented in a logical, easy to follow path. And sometimes students may, or learners may, ask for the instructions again because it's not quite clear enough. And I would recommend giving the explicit instructions again and not being upset that you're asked the same thing over and over again. Okay, so I think the idea is just to give some grace and realize that there's a lot of information out there and people need certain information at certain times. And so if you're asked to explain the same thing over and over again, then just do it. Students can also participate in building a social community in their classes. And I would say that students could ask for these things. So we talked about things that teachers can do to build community. And if teachers are not doing it, then students can ask for it. And if that doesn't work, or even if it does, you also, as students, have some control over what you do. And so you can set these things up yourself. So you can, when you're offered a discussion board in class, or you have an opportunity to raise your hand and share an idea in class, you should take it. And these opportunities to share yourself in class and your ideas are part of creating the community. So I think it's important for every individual to realize that their learning is contributing to the group's learning. And if you don't contribute your knowledge, then you are like denying your community the benefit of your ideas. You can turn your video on. That makes it easier for people to see you as a person and to begin to create this community. You can set up study groups. And if you might have opportunities to do that through your class, but if you don't, you can do that outside of class. And then finally, just check up on each other, okay? You can take a minute just to ask somebody how they're doing and if they need any help with anything. And I think that goes a long way toward creating this sense that we're all in this together and we all want everybody to do well. And part of that is to participate in the community. So there are solutions for making connections, even in an online environment. And in fact, sometimes these solutions in an online environment may be preferable to some of the solutions in an in-person environment. So I would encourage you to take advantage of technology in order to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Don't just use technology for the sake of using it, but choose what you want to accomplish and match the technology to your goal. At the University of Texas, we have access to Zoom, which I know a lot of people do. And Zoom has quite a few features that you can use to build community into the learning process. There's video, there's a chat, there's breakout rooms where small groups can discuss, work together on a product, solve problems together. And there's also reaction icons where people can be reacting or raising their hand and then sharing in class. I will use breakout rooms as an example of something that might even be better online than it is in class. Because if you imagine you have a room full of, I don't know, 100 people or 200 people, and you ask them to get into small groups and talk to each other, there's like a small roar or maybe a large roar in the room. And it can be difficult to hear even your neighbors. And in contrast, in Zoom, if you have breakout rooms, individuals go to their own room. So it's like having 50 rooms right there. And your own little group is there, those people in the group are all you hear. And so you actually have quite a bit more, the environment is quite a bit nicer, I think, in a breakout room, with the exception that you're not there sitting in person with each other. At the University of Texas, we also have a learning management system, and the one that we use is Canvas. And the learning management systems overall generally have tools that can be used for interacting. They have discussion boards and opportunities to form groups of students that can work on assignments together. So that's another good option for making community. Other options students can do on their own, like setting up GroupMe chats, using Google Docs to work on assignments collaboratively. And then there's a final app called Padlet that I'm just going to show you what it looks like. Padlet is a virtual bulletin board, and the users of a Padlet of a board can just basically stick virtual sticky notes onto the board and use those to share ideas with each other. So this is an example of what a Padlet looks like. This is a screenshot of a small part of a Padlet board from my class. And this is the first one from this semester. And students were asked to share some information about themselves. So this is another great way to develop community is that we mentioned was just about sharing about yourself, being a little bit open and willing to share who you are with your community. And so a Padlet is a good way to have a lot of people share something about themselves. Later in the semester, you can also have different kinds of Padlets where students are sharing questions and answers and resources and any other information that where they could help each other learning the content of the course. So not only learning about themselves and each other, but also they can be helping each other with the content. So to sum up, we talked today about how learning leads to physical changes in the brain. We talked about 7 principles that sum up the research on how people learn. We talked about learning as a process of construction, and that this is a challenge for learners because this puts the task on them to actually do the constructing or the building of their understanding. We talked about how humans are social creatures and that therefore, and because of that, learning is a social activity. So more learning will happen in a social community than without the social community. There is a framework for building learning communities, and that framework emphasizes thinking, socializing, and teaching. I want to emphasize that building the social part into an online class has to be done intentionally, much more intentionally than it does in an in-person class. And so that's something where some effort may be taken, may be needed to build that social community into the online class. And then there's technology these days that students and teachers can use to help with building that social environment, the social presence in the community where everyone can feel comfortable in sharing themselves and everyone feels real in the community and can help each other learn. I'd like to thank you for being here, and I will stop sharing my slides.
Okay, Kristin, thank you. So don't go anywhere, folks. Give us a second, Kristin. We're going to assemble Kristin's panel of 3 experts, and she will introduce them. And then this is your chance to ask questions, typing them into the YouTube chat. And Kristin and her panelists will answer questions until 8:30 when we'll call it a night. So give Kristin a warm round of mental applause, and she'll jump in now and introduce her 3 expert panelists.
There. Sorry, I was having some issues there. All right, so I would like to give a warm welcome to 3 panelists that we have today. I think it's going to be a fantastic discussion. We have Dr. Omid Fatoui, who is a social psychologist. And Omid is passionate about translating research into practice. He is a research associate for the University of Pittsburgh and the director of learning innovation at WGU Labs, which is a nonprofit research hub. Omid works mostly in the domains of health, athletics, and education. And in his spare time, he likes to present to the public on various psychology topics. I think it's great that he uses running as therapy. Our second panelist, Dr. Kristin Procco, is an associate professor of instruction in the molecular biosciences department at the University of Texas in Austin. She has taught master's level courses in chemistry and biochemistry for nearly a decade. And she leads a team dedicated to improving visual literacy instruction in the biological sciences. So she produces animated 3D videos that allow viewers to explore biological molecules, like complex molecules in 3D for her YouTube channel, Molecular Memory. Tapera Holman is the director, or this is our third panelist. Tapera Holman is the director of the TIP Scholars program. TIP Scholars is an academic learning community in the College of Natural Sciences. He is also a doctoral student in the program for higher education leadership, and he's very interested in research on rural Black college students, first-generation college students, and overall student success. So I would like to welcome the 3 of them warmly to this panel, and we can begin to answer questions.
Did you want us to jump in?
Sorry, I'm going to read the questions to you. So the first question is, when a particular individual has difficulty asking for help or is incapable of doing so due to social anxiety, does this significantly affect that person's ability to learn new things? Anybody know the answer to that, or an answer? Have a comment?
Yeah, I'll jump in. This is a really great question, and something that we as social psychologists, I would say, probably think about a fair bit. But to answer the question, I have to take one small step back and give you a broad view of an approach that social psychology takes, which specifically has to do with the central belief that people are meaning-making machines, that we take the perceptions, the sensations in our lives, and we have a certain level of abstraction that then leads to the perceptions that we form, the narratives, the interpretations, the meanings of events in our lives. And as we navigate through life, we have this meaning-making machine that is guiding our inferences around what things mean. Now, why I take a moment to sort of explain that seemingly simple observation is because there are differences in the way that people can make meaning about the same event. So an individual who may get a D in a math class might take that to be evidence that they didn't study for the right sections, that they probably should have worked in a group of people, they should have asked their teacher a question, and consequently will engage in all of those behaviors and hopefully get a better grade next time. Another student who gets that same grade might instead infer, this is evidence that I'm not smart enough, I'm an admissions error, and I shouldn't be here in the first place. Therefore, they're not going to seek out help from their peers or their faculty. They're probably going to struggle to learn the content. They're probably less likely to raise their hand and ask a question. And consequently, they'll do more poorly on that next test. Now, what's really, I think, interesting is that once they do more poorly on that next test, they then go ahead and reconfirm their initial uncertainty and anxiety about what a negative grade means to them. And by that point, it's more difficult to change that narrative. And so when we talk about students having difficulty asking questions, from a social psychological perspective, what we're interested in is why is that the case and what meaning are they attributing to the task or the behavior of raising their hand. And so if for that student, raising their hand becomes a signal of whether they will be evaluated positively or negatively, and they don't feel the trust that they will be, then that can loom large. That way it brings in a cognitive tax that adds pressure to that moment. And consequently, when they're struggling with both understanding the content as well as the anxiety of whether they'll be evaluated negatively, they're also less likely to learn effectively in that moment. And it all begins with the interpretations and the attributions that they have around how they think they'll be perceived, whether they'll be valued, and whether they'll be accepted for the behavior they're about to engage in. So I'll pause there, but hopefully that answers your question, which is to say that yes, absolutely. I think the anxiety about raising your hand can in itself actually be a cause for why people may not be able to learn as effectively as they ought to, because what they're doing is they're sort of navigating a lot of different cognitive burdens and taxes when they ought to be just focused, calm, and processing and digesting the content.
Can I add something on a practical level? I think it's our responsibilities as educators to create an environment in which students or learners have the ability or feel like they have the ability to ask those questions and bring their authentic selves. You know, a lot of times we talk about this idea of imposter syndrome, and students a lot of times in that situation are feeling like imposters, like they're not supposed to be there. How did they get there? One of a tool that we like to use a lot in our program is this idea of storytelling. By normalizing it for students, our hope is that they're able to build a community and they're not afraid to raise their hand, to ask questions, because they're seeing like it's normal. Other people have been in their situation. If they can hear the stories of other individuals, hopefully it normalizes things for them and they're not afraid to step out and engage. And then in that case, they're able to learn the material when they're not so afraid to step out into it.
And I think it's important that we can create different spaces for these learners, because for some of them, Zoom might be really terrifying, and being in a breakout room with their peers and turning on their camera for whatever reason, they don't want to show the space they're in, or, you know, they have anxieties. And so I've used a lot of asynchronous discussions. And I've in my prior life teaching, I had a lot of students returning to school and they were uncomfortable with the technology. And they told me later that that type of situation allowed them the time to think and process and still interact with their peers, but in a less anxiety inducing way.
Another question that might be related is, what if one of the learners is on the autism spectrum and has difficulty forming social connections?
Yeah, I'll take this. I mean, there are certainly some mental, physical, social, identity kinds of concerns that are very real for many people. And I think if one of those is partially a cause for effective learning and social integration, and hopefully there's also resources that can help to address and remedy those underlying conditions and or experiences to the extent possible by medical science. And I'm not an expert on those, so I'll sort of contextualize it that way. What I will say from a social psychological perspective is that in any instance, there's again that certain degree of subjectivity where individuals are making meaning around what does it mean for me to be feeling what I'm feeling in this moment. And they're making inferences around how they think they'll be regarded, how they think they'll be perceived, how they think they'll be valued. And as was mentioned, this tool or strategy of normalizing can be incredibly powerful, almost independent of other issues or concerns or identities or labels that people might be engaging in their learning with. Because within each of those situations, again, there's that bit of flexibility. And what normalizing does to a certain extent is it does two things. One is that it conveys that the experiences that you have, the feelings that you have, the uncertainty that you have about raising your hand, about what it means to learn something new, about making new friends, that uncertainty is actually almost universally felt. And so you are sharing the fact that your experience, your emotional and psychological experience, regardless of the cause, is actually universal. It's felt by almost everybody across many identities and many groups. So that's the first thing. The second thing that normalizing can do and does really well is it has to explicitly connect the cause of the uncertainty to something external to oneself. And what I mean by that is you can convey that the feelings of uncertainty about making new friends or raising your hand are a normal part of the transition to college or a normal part of being in a large classroom. Because when you are able to contextualize the cause of the uncertainties as being a normal part of the environment and not a reflection of something that's internal and stable to you, then they start to realize that these feelings that I have are commonly experienced, and they are things that will dissipate over time as I progress in my transition to college or as I get more comfortable in class. So if you can do those two things to an individual who is struggling either socially or with anxiety to help mitigate the pressure for why they feel they are feeling that way, then that can potentially be helpful.
So here's a question about dopamine. So does the release of dopamine during these positive social interactions result in improved cognition and learning? Anybody know?
I don't want to be talking too much, but I know a little bit about dopamine, which is to say that dopamine, one of the effects that it has is actually to calm adrenaline. That in the activation of dopamine, again, what you're able to do is to calm the nerves to a certain extent. And by doing so, you're again reducing the pressure or the anxiety that an individual might have. Someone gave me a really good example of how dopamine can come online and consequently reduce that state of adrenaline or stress. Imagine if you're unsure about how you're doing in a class, you've had some negative social interactions, and you go home and someone tells you a joke. And it's a funny joke. In that moment, there's a sort of an activation of dopamine that makes you forget the stress that you've had. And so again, if there's anything that dopamine can do is hopefully to reduce the stress hormones that might be preventing you from processing information adaptively.
Here's a different question. So is there a social way to encourage the learners to keep an open mind and to be willing to consider information that is opposed to what they believe is true? I mean, you might be the only one. You might be the only one who knows.
Great. Yeah, no, so I'm happy to. I don't mean to monopolize here, so feel free to jump in. But yes, actually, there's a lot of really interesting ways that we can even hijack social psychology to help achieve some of these outcomes. There's some really intriguing work around how identity can be leveraged to foster greater social connection or even certain desired behaviors. And the premise for that is that we are social creatures, and as such, we all occupy multiple social identities at any given one time. So right now I'm a presenter, my kids are in the basement about to go to sleep, so I'm also a parent. Sometimes I put on my running shoes, I'm a runner. And anytime one of these social identities potentially is activated, then there's that potential for evaluation or affirmation that also comes online. And specifically how our social identities, given that we have multiple social identities, can be leveraged adaptively is by recognizing that whenever we feel that one of our social identities is valued, then that really helps to put us in this optimal state of learning and openness and social cohesion. Some really intriguing studies that have demonstrated this is in one set of studies, what they did is before the 2012 elections, I believe it was, they went out and they asked potential voters to answer a survey that was worded in one of two ways. In the one condition, they asked potential voters, how important is it for you to go out and vote in tomorrow's election? In the other condition, they asked, how important is it for you to be a voter in tomorrow's election? Now, seemingly similar, the distinction here is that in one condition, the participants had to write why it's important to engage in this behavior. In the other condition, they had to explain why it was important for their identity as a voter to go out and vote the next day. And after you spent about 15, 20 minutes writing about why it's important that you are a voter compared to you engaging in voting behavior, that actually helped to internalize the identity of being a learner, or sorry, a voter, and therefore they actually found that in that condition, people were significantly more likely to go out and vote the next day. They've just basically spent 20 minutes declaring why it's important that they are a voter. And so in tomorrow's election, when the opportunity arises, they have to be consistent with their self-view after having said that it is important to them. So they're more likely to go out and vote the next day. And again, this is based on some classic research on cognitive dissonance, where they brought in participants into this lab setting. And one condition, they asked participants to basically write really boring phrases on the blackboard. And then right before leaving, they said, oh, by the way, would you mind telling the next participant that what you just did was actually kind of enjoyable, despite the fact that it was not at all enjoyable. And the manipulation was either that they said, oh, and by the way, we'll pay you either $1 for telling this person that it was enjoyable, or we'll pay you something like $20 to tell them that this activity was enjoyable. And what they found, surprisingly, is that individuals who were paid more money once they were surveyed a week later were less likely to say that they would be willing to come back into the lab compared to people who were paid less money, because after having done this boring task and then telling someone that it was actually not that boring, you've got to try to figure out why you just did that. And if the rationalization is that I just got paid $20 to do it, then that's easy. So therefore, I don't want to go back and do that boring task. But if there is no rationalization for why you just told that next person that it was actually not that boring, your conclusion is that I must have really not disliked it as much as I thought. And so you've now internalized this belief that I maybe enjoyed it and we're more likely to go back into the lab. And the conclusion with all of this is that you can, again, sort of in a sneaky way, find ways to allow students to internalize adaptive identities by putting them in positions where they're not the beneficiaries of the learning, but possibly the benefactors. So maybe putting them in a role of leadership to help ease the transition of their peers, getting their advice on the experience of being in a remote learning environment and then sharing that out with other students, or anything else that makes them feel valued, recognized, and appreciated, so that that identity as a learner is internalized without coercion, without the consequence of grades or the rewards of something external. So I think there's a lot of strategies that you can employ to achieve these outcomes.
Thanks. Here's another question. As we try to build a community in the classroom, are there specific strategies we can use to ensure that underrepresented people are included and will also benefit?
I can share a little bit about this one. I would say there's three things that come to my mind with this question. The first thing is, as much as possible, allow or let the students help create community guidelines for their classroom. One of the tools that I've seen, particularly in some of my grad school classes, is our professor will break us up into breakout rooms on Zoom, and we will go and create guidelines for the classroom and the learning community. And I think that's a great way for students to feel engaged in a process, and especially for underrepresented students, because they're allowing their voices to be heard in the way that the classroom is being conducted. Secondly, I would say validate their experiences and views and perspectives as real, that those are real for them and that they're real things. So definitely validating their experiences. And then thirdly, I would say thinking about examples, materials that are used in class. How are you using examples that are representing and highlighting the experiences of underrepresented people, so that they see examples, they can see themselves in the classroom, in the community, in the work, whatever the discipline may be, that they can see themselves there, that they're feeling included in the things that are being shared in the material, in examples that are being used in the classroom. But as much as you can highlight the voices and experiences of underrepresented people within the space, I think that's goes a long way in helping students or underrepresented individuals feel represented and heard and want to join the community and the space.
A lot of my colleagues are using the like social contracts and really having the students very involved in the process. So it sounds like that has been a very successful strategy.
Kristin, here's another question specifically for you. You mentioned before asynchronous activities that you use to help the learners feel more comfortable, and someone would like to know more about those asynchronous activities.
Great. My two favorites are the asynchronous discussions, and through the asynchronous discussions, I'm trying to get them to interact with each other, interact with me. I'm really involved in their asynchronous discussions, but also have them collaborate. And so I'm in the natural sciences, so usually what we do is problem-based. What they need for their exams is to be able to solve problems. And so my classes in the past were a maximum of 20. So that was kind of nice to run a whole discussion board where the students could tackle questions or in my case, problems. And so I'd give a problem, like maybe for a class of 27 problems would be there. The students would sign up for their groups, usually on a doodle poll, just to make that a little easier for me. And then they'd go in and they had to contribute on several of the problems in some way, but they lead on one problem. And so their job is to like moderate the discussion, get everybody's views together, and come up with a final answer for that question as a team. And in the and part of their requirement was to say what they did. Each of them takes ownership of their contribution to the team. So they have to write that as part of their assignment on the assignment itself. And you know, the students that you'd see, one was like, I really didn't get this problem, but let me do the structures, or let me contribute this explanation so I can be sure to contribute and be sure that I understand the material. And then the second favorite activity is peer review. And so, of course, you know, not having them grade each other, but on an ongoing project that goes throughout the semester, which was a research paper, have them write their abstract, have them write their background. And at each of these checkpoints, they'd exchange with a student who would, you know, critique. I always require a critique and a compliment. And so they get something, you know, positive said to them as well. And then the students reflect on their own paper in the same way that they made the critique. And so they go through and then they self-evaluate, not for a grade, well, you know, a participation grade for the peer review activities. It's very awkward for students to like assign an A or a B to something. So keeping that just kind of light and self-reflective.
What are some ways that peers can encourage other shy learners to join in a group conversation where they might not feel comfortable without making them feel talked about or put on the spot?
One of the tools that we encourage our students to try to use is this idea of stepping up and stepping back. And so that's noticing in spaces when me as an individual may be taking up a lot of space and talking a lot, and maybe trying to step back a little bit and allow other people to speak. If I notice that I'm answering every time a question is posed or someone has something to say, can I step back and wait and see if there's someone else who wants to take an opportunity to speak up? And then maybe even without putting them on the spot, but inviting the person who may be a little bit quieter or shyer to say, hey, I would love to hear your perspective. So maybe asking them, do they have something that they would like to share in a moment, because their voice is valuable and may not have been heard in the conversation. So this idea of stepping up and stepping back is something that we try to encourage our students to use within the classroom, is like noticing when they're taking up a lot of space or when their voice actually hasn't been shared within the space. It's a small tool that we try to use.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And sort of what it highlights is the role that we as faculty in our classrooms have in creating the norms, that is the implicit rules that students come to abide by. And to the extent that we can be explicit with those, then we're only offering greater clarity in moments of social ambiguity. And so the stepping up and stepping back is a perfect example of, you know, how do I know how to calibrate adding too much or being too quiet? There are other things that you can also, you know, make sure that you can include. For instance, conveying that it's normal to be shy and uncertain, especially when you don't know something, and that's okay. You can help to normalize the fundamental experience. And Kristin, you did this quite well in your opening presentation, to convey that learning is going to be uncomfortable. That optimal learning is that you're going to put yourself in that state where you don't yet know something, which by definition will mean that you don't feel confident about it yet. And so you can normalize that experience so that when a student feels like I don't know something, it's not that I'm shy, that I'm a shy person, it's that I'm engaging in learning. Another thing that you can do is to convey that everyone will feel uncertain at times, but that everyone is nice and committed to the goals of learning. What you're doing with that one is you're portraying each other as friendly individuals and peers, so that if an individual does feel shy, they feel less hesitant to speak up to each other. And if you're not shy, then that narrative that my teacher thinks we're all nice people will also color the kinds of contributions that the non-shy people will have and make them more likely to reach out to students who might be shy.
Here's an interesting challenge. So when a person has a significant learning curve with regard to technology and socialization, for example, a man who has been homeless for the last 30 years, can that person realistically learn in this climate?
Why wouldn't they? Right, and I think that's probably one of the things that we can both challenge in ourselves, recognizing that if we buy into some of the stereotypes around classes or identity, where we think there are significant constraints to learning. I'm not here again to argue that there's no basis for some of these biological reasons for differences in learning, but there's also a component that's psychological. And to the extent that we allow ourselves to buy into those, then we're only allowing them to reinforce themselves. And one of the really common ones is this notion that as you get older, you don't learn as effectively. And again, I'm not here to argue the neuroscience of it, but to the extent that someone who is older has the experience of learning, which we've defined as putting yourself in that place of discomfort, what is the interpretation that they come up with absent any other information? They look around, they don't perceive that other students are also feeling uncomfortable. All they see is that they are different somehow because they're older. And so the narrative that they land on is that I must not be able to do this because I am older. And so we can challenge these, I think. If we perceive that someone has this notion, then maybe we have a conversation with them. Or as we mentioned earlier, we create the norms where we convey that learning is difficult, learning is challenging, and that we're here to challenge each other and support each other, regardless of some of these other factors.
And I think a great way to identify who these learners might be, because especially online, you know, they may be a picture, they may just be their name, but to do a survey, and the survey has to have a small point value associated with it. But, you know, how comfortable are you with these things? Do you see any barriers in using technology? And hopefully they can get to the survey and do that. Maybe a little welcome video, even showing them their first steps of getting onto their LMS and clicking on the survey could really help just, you know, those first time. Or, you know, I've had people returning after a full career and deciding that they want to teach at a community college. And so they come back after many, many years, and the technology is a little alarming to them. But guiding them through in that way and identifying them by just asking a few questions, you know, then you could reach out individually to the students that you think may struggle.
Aside from explicitly telling learners, in this case, freshman university students, that they all belong, and asking them to please open up to each other, do you have any advice for facilitating trust when they're working in small breakout rooms?
Oh, Kristin, I almost think you should answer that because of those wonderful icebreakers that you did with us in training this summer. Would you be willing to share one of those?
Well, so the concept of icebreakers, I think, is a great idea. And so, and the idea is to don't just expect students to go into a breakout room and suddenly feel like they're a community. They have to become comfortable with each other. And so that often involves learning something about each other and just spending some time gaining that trust and seeing that people in their breakout room are like them in some ways. And so one specific example that Omid knows about is an icebreaker called, I don't know if I would call it an icebreaker, an activity called Fast Friends. And it's a series of questions that are arranged in different levels. So there's like level 1, which are not very personal, and level 2, which become more personal, and level 3, which are quite personal. And so the idea is you have students start out at talking to each other about less personal things, and then gradually move into more personal things. And that fairly quickly through these conversations, people can become quite comfortable with each other. And if you do things like that, it doesn't have to be this particular one, it could be other kinds of what we call icebreakers, where people have a chance to get more comfortable with each other before they're asked to work together on a course related topic. Then that helps a lot.
Yeah, I love that idea of icebreakers, and that's exactly what I was going to say, because it anchors it gives students a little bit of an anchor, something to come back to, or a connection point when they're trying to get to know each other, or trying to work on a project together. The other piece I would say, if it's possible, if you know icebreakers aren't your thing, if you can have maybe upperclassmen or peer leaders in there to help also facilitate that process a little bit. If that's an option, I think that's also a great tool to be able to utilize in some of those breakout rooms. So if you could have undergraduate TAs who could help facilitate some of those early on conversations, that's another tool that may be utilized.
Here, I have a follow-up question for you about that. Do you think that those facilitators, like peer facilitators, would have to be upperclassmen, or could they just be their classmates that volunteered to take on that role?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be upperclassmen. Sometimes I tend to think about the upperclassmen because they can speak about their experiences maybe in the coursework or in the class or with the university. But if you have someone who's that go-getter, who's a first-year student, who's doing it as well, who's willing to do it, but I think you can have peers who could lead that conversation. I think they need. I would argue though a little bit of training is needed sometimes to help facilitate those conversations. But it could be someone on their same. It could be a first-year student to a first-year student.
Okay, here's another question. Do you think that being part of a group that experiences structural violence in academia affects the way they learn? Are there any reoccurring patterns in the way these learners learn?
I mean, that's a powerful question, and certainly I won't be able to answer it fully. But I think you know the essence of asking that question underlies a lot of what feeds into an optimal learning experience, which again is based on the notion of trust and safety. If you want students to put themselves in a vulnerable state of not knowing, you would hope that they feel safe in that environment. And if there are experiences, individual, personal, or structural, that threaten that sense of safety, then in the back of their minds, they'll be wondering about that basic need of safety and trust, rather than being able to focus on the task at hand. So I think absolutely there's going to be compromises to effective learning if there's any threats, real or perceived, of violence or lack of trust among individuals or groups. So yeah.
Do you all have some examples of explicit instructions that could facilitate social interactions?
Sorry, Kristin, I want to understand your question. Is it more generally or related to the previous question?
Oh, it's not related to the previous question.
Okay, great.
I think this might actually be referring to something from the presentation about giving explicit instructions. And so one thing I would say is that to keep in mind that in a regular classroom environment where you're in person, you have a lot of opportunities to get signals about whether people understand from body language and from just passing comments that people make, and you don't have any of that when you're online. And so you have to think a little bit more carefully about what are all the steps involved in accomplishing a task, and you can't leave anything out because you don't have as many opportunities to correct that as if you're in person. Another way of answering that question is to focus on the social interactions part. And then I think we might be talking about how to facilitate people getting to know each other and trust each other. And again, that comes back to the icebreakers and also the facilitation of doing the icebreakers. So we often find that it's helpful to assign roles to people in a small group. So one person might be given the role of being the timekeeper so that you can make sure you accomplish the task in a certain time. Another person might be given the role of being a note taker. And another person might be the facilitator, whose job is to make sure that all the people in the group have a chance to speak. So sometimes I think assigning those roles just makes it clear that those activities have to happen.
And I like to just jump in with something that didn't work because, you know, we like to share the things that did work. But when I started out, I was like, oh, I have to really structure these discussions. And so every student should contribute some original idea, and then they should reply to this many other people. And in over structuring it, I think it was really limiting, and students were really like looking, oh my gosh, how do I do this? And so in the future assignments, I structured it that, you know, some of your posts should include a reference. Some of them may be conversational, but those don't count for full credit or something like that, to kind of guide the social interaction so that they could have the back and forth. But I was also getting them to contribute some meaningful, you know, contributions that I was looking for in the discussions.
Can I just add one piece as we talk about building social communities? I don't want it to be lost that it also takes a little bit of time. It doesn't happen immediately. And so I think it'd be really important not to think that if it's a classroom environment in the first class, you're going to build that community and you're going to be good to go. It really does take time and investment in coming back to that community. It's not going to happen within the first shot, and so you have to keep investing into it for that community to be built, whether that would be in person or through a virtual format.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not one and done, right? Yeah. So I did want to ask, there's a question about exercise. So is cardio exercise like running better than gym workouts like weightlifting or yoga for boosting cognitive ability? Why or why not?
I'm terribly biased for running, but my answer actually is that ultimately, whatever you're excited to do, you're most likely to do, and so any activity will absolutely be the best activity if you enjoy doing it and will repeatedly do it. That being said, running I think is the best, so I'll stop there.
And I just think be pleased with yourself for keeping to an exercise routine during the pandemic.
And then there's two questions that they won't read word for word, but they're about, and this is our last question, by the way, that are about do you have any key advice for people who teach younger people, like people in elementary school or middle school remotely?
So I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm going to jump in because I have a 6-year-old who is doing virtual first grade, and I'm working from home right now. And so it's interesting trying to navigate both of the spaces as he's on his Zoom calls and I'm on my Zoom calls throughout the day. I'll say one of the things as a parent on this side of it is going back to the explicit instructions, like the parents need to know explicitly what their children need to be doing. One of the issues that we're running in a lot with our elementary kid is that he'll hear one thing from the teacher and we're like, is that what you're really supposed to be doing? Because we're the ones who are having to engage with him to make sure the work is getting done. So that idea of explicit instructions, I think, is really important on the elementary side, but remembering that you have to, it's not just the student, you have to engage with the caretakers, the parents, the guardians as well, and sharing that information. And that's totally from a parent perspective. And then I think giving them breaks. They can't sit on a Zoom call or a social call all day long. You have to have lots of breaks in there where they can break it up, giving a mini lecture and then sending them off to go do a task and having the parents know what that task is.
Okay, folks, we could go on for a long time, but we've hit 8:30, so how about a clap for everybody? Kristin, Tapera, and Omid, thank you so much. Awesome. We'll have to do it again sometime soon, but thank you so much for that.